Hi everyone, welcome back to Guilt Index. I begin as always with the index. So last week we talked a lot about guarantees in the art market and at auction homes. And the thing is, after I posted about that episode, kind of like specifically about the auction guarantees, a friend reached out and provided a really kind of unique argument that I had not fully considered. And I think that I was trying to get there with the episode last week, but I guess wasn't fully researched. So this week we're going to dive a little bit deeper into those kinds of themes. So there's a specific part of the argument that I had not considered, and it fully sharpened the whole argument that I was trying to make last week. So let's dive right in. So kind of in the argument, the person said, the dynamic you're describing isn't exactly unique to art. In an IPO, when a company goes public, the demand is in fact exactly like the guarantees. They are in fact pre-negotiated, and then anchor investors commit to buying more of a large block of shares before the public offering even happens. Their commitment signals kind of to everyone else that the offering is in fact credible. So demand is prefixed there too. Where it gets interesting, that my friend mentioned, is he said in the secondary market, because in the art world there are kind of two additional mechanisms layered on top of what we talked about. One is you cannot sell a piece and fail to sell it without consequence. There tends to be a real threat in what the industry calls burning. And then two, galleries do have a right to a first refusal to buy a work back, specifically kind of to prevent the market from discovering what it's actually worth. And then there was a question posed, and it was, so who actually sets the price for art? So that's the index, and let's find out. So here is what I think after spending a week really pulling this apart, researching it, and trying to get to the deeper kind of theme that I was trying to present in last week. So the price of a work of art is not discovered. It is agreed upon. It is set in advance by a very small number of people who kind of all benefit from everyone else believing it was discovered. So I'm calling this consensus fiction, and I want to walk through that in three mechanisms, like the three mechanisms that build it, because each one is doing kind of different work, and together they are almost airtight. And I want to start kind of where I left off, because it turns out the comparison goes much deeper than I guess like me and my friends that we were talking about last week's episode even thought of. We actually have a very great example of this that has happened recently. So SpaceX obviously went public this month. It is by dollar, one of the largest IPOs in history. The company raised over $75 billion before a single share traded on the open exchange, and on the day retail investors were finally allowed to buy, the stock rose about 19%. Here's what happened before that 19% number existed for the public to see. So before the IPO opened, a small group of institutional investors, or the anchor investors, committed to buying kind of a defined block of shares at a price negotiated privately with the company and its underwriters. Their commitment is disclosed specifically because the disclosure itself does work. It kind of signals to every retail investor who has never evaluated SpaceX's actual financials that kind of serious well-credited money already decided that this was worth buying. In fact, actually, the academic research on this mechanism describes its function pretty precisely. Anchor investments reduce what's called underpricing risk by reducing the heterogeneity of investors' beliefs, which is a very precise and academic way of saying it gets everyone to agree on a price faster by showing them someone credible agreed first. So you kind of see that is the guarantee, that is kind of the entire art market's pre-sale mechanism, kind of point for point, bar for bar, I would say. And the 78% of New York's evening sale value was that was guaranteed in 2025, and kind of the figure I mentioned in last week's episode is functionally like SpaceX's anchor tranche. The price floor was set by people who are not really in the room, and they don't have to be, and it doesn't even have to be disclosed under New York's like current rules. The same way SpaceX's anchor commitment was set and disclosed before the public ever really even got to bid. But kind of here's where I did not fully get to in conversations with friends after the previous episode, is it turns out to be kind of more than the anchor itself. Elon Musk, who does control just under half of all SpaceX shares, agreed to a 366-day lockup. Obviously, he and other significant early investors are contractually barred from selling their shares for a full year after the IPO. And the broader pool of pre-IPO shareholders is released on a tiered schedule, so 7% increments at specific intervals, kind of building to full release at 180 days. The explicit purpose of this, according to Jay Ritter, director of the IPO initiative at the University of Florida, is that insiders typically have information the public does not, so kind of letting them sell immediately would functionally be trading on that information, so basically just insider trading. But there's a second kind of more interesting reason, the one a market researcher named Lise Bayer pointed to directly. If everyone with a real stake kind of sold on day one, it would obviously spook new investors and take the air out of the entire offering. The lockup does not exist to protect the company. It really just does exist to protect the price. It prevents the people who know the most and who have the most reason to kind of cash out immediately from testing the new public price against kind of their own private judgment before outside investors have really had a chance to fall in love with the number. For example, when Facebook's lockup expired in 2012, shares had already fallen more than 40% from the offering price, and by the time insiders were kind of finally allowed to sell freely, the market was simply waiting the entire time, and the lockup did not prevent the price discovery, it kind of just delayed it. Okay, now pause. Hold that thought because we're going to need it in just a little minute. So the lockup is doing kind of two things simultaneously. It is preventing the immediate, possibly humiliating test of the new price, kind of the way burning would humiliate an unsold painting. And it is also controlling exactly when and how kind of previously committed shares can re-enter the open market, the way a right of first refusal controls exactly when and how a painting can re-enter circulation. The IPO market kind of does both of those things with one single standardized, obviously publicly disclosed contractual mechanism, but the art market needs two separate, mostly undisclosed, individually negotiated ones. That difference I feel like is going to kind of turn out to be one of the most interesting parts of this episode. Obviously, in the stock market, a share can trade down. It can obviously trade down a lot. The way SpaceX's eventually will when the lockup ends and supplies kind of flood in, just like Facebook's did in 2012, falling over 40%. That is simply the market repricing information. There's no permanent reputational penalty attached to a stock, obviously just having a bad day, because every share is identical to every other share of the same class. A bad day is kind of just a data point. On the other hand though, a painting that fails to sell at auction is not just like a stock on a bad day. It is kind of, in the industry's own language, burned. Once a work is burned, the general wisdom confirmed by an actual academic study is that its value decreases permanently because there is now kind of a public record of a lack of interest in the specific unrepeatable object. Actually, a 2008 study by Oxford University economists Alan Beggs and Catherine Grady examined this and found so much like valuable information to exactly what I'm saying. So they examined Christie's and Sotheby's sales between the years 1980 and 1990, specifically kind of like to test this, and their findings were works that had been burned and then later resold returned 30% less than works that sold on the first attempt. That's 30% permanently for the same object. This is the part SpaceX's lockup does not need because a share has no memory. A failed first attempt to sell 10 million SpaceX shares on day one would not follow those specific shares around forever because shares are fungible, they're interchangeable, and they're obviously anonymous. A painting is none of those things. It is one object with obviously one history, and public failure becomes part of that history permanently. The Beggs and Grady research identifies this mechanism precisely. Buyers do not evaluate a painting independently. They infer what other buyers think about it. A failed sale is not data about the painting. It becomes the painting's data forever. So the art market built kind of an entire informal social practice, the subtle withdrawal, to do the job that SpaceX's lockup does mechanically and obviously legally. In May, actually, Sotheby's pulled Egon Schiele's Danae from its Impressionist and Modern Evening sale literally just before bidding began, and it was a painting that would have represented at least 15% of the entire sales estimated total. The house obviously did not explain why. The presumed reason, reported kind of plainly by Artsy, was the absence of bidders. Pulling it before the gavel protects the painting's kind of future value, the same way SpaceX's tiered release protects the stock's price discovery from happening kind of all at once, obviously in public, before sentiment has had time to set. The big difference is that SpaceX's protection is written into a 366-day contract that every retail investor can read in its prospectus. The art market's protection is an unwritten kind of understanding between an auction house and a consignor, obviously executed quietly with no disclosure requirements at all. The right of first refusal is a clause increasingly kind of standard in gallery sale contracts. It requires that a buyer who wants to resell a work has to first offer it back to the gallery, usually the price of what a third party has already offered. So here's kind of what it actually does. So let's say you buy a painting from a gallery for 50 grand, and 2 years later the artist market has taken off and a collector offers you $400,000. So before you can obviously accept, you must let the gallery at least try to match it and let them know. The art newspaper's reporting on this quotes a London advisor saying that nearly every transaction she is now involved in carries some kind of version of this restriction. Now compare this to SpaceX's tiered lockup. The lockup eventually expires after 180 days. Every early shareholder is fully free to sell to anyone at any price with kind of no further restriction. The mechanism has an expiration date kind of built into its design specifically, so that price discovery, once delayed, is allowed to happen kind of completely and openly. A right of first refusal, by contrast, often does not expire in any kind of meaningful sense. The art form reporting on this document's cause, requiring buyers to resell exclusively through his own gallery, like full stop and indefinitely. Christie's required actually a 5-year right of first refusal and a permanent 15% resale royalty on a 2020 sale of work by Black artists. The right of first refusal can kind of prevent it from ever happening fully at all. Gilbert Edelson, counsel to the Art Dealers Association of America, has defended these clauses by arguing that uncontrolled resale draws in speculators who only buy to flip rather than collectors who buy to keep. Kind of notice what that defense actually concedes. It concedes the clause exists to prevent the market from setting its own price indefinitely and not just to smooth out one volatile day the way the lockup does. The gallery does not get kind of a temporary head start, it gets a permanent veto. So who actually gets to set the price of art, and what does the SpaceX comparison actually kind of tell us once you follow it all the way through? So kind of here's what I keep landing on. The IPO market solved this problem once with one tool. The lockup simultaneously prevents kind of the burn by delaying the moment of public price testing until sentiment has had time to settle, and controls the right of resale by legally restricting exactly when shares can kind of re-enter circulation. It's one contract, both functions, and critically it expires after 180 days, or in Elon Musk's case 366. The protection ends and the market is kind of finally allowed to find out what the stock is actually worth to a stranger with no stakes in the outcome. The art market really never built that like single tool. Instead, it built two separate ones, evolved kind of independently, neither with an expiration date written into it from the start. The burn threat is informal and social. It's obviously unwritten, and kind of from that though, effectively permanent. There is no day 180 where in which a burned painting's history resets. The right of first refusal is formal, it's contractual, and in cases like cause, explicitly indefinite. Together they do kind of the lockup's job more thoroughly than the lockup itself. I think this tells you something real about why the art market is kind of harder to defend than the IPO market, even though they are kind of structurally doing the same thing. The SEC requires the lockup to be disclosed in the prospectus, and it has a defined endpoint that every investor can find and really plan around. New York stopped requiring any of the art market's kind of equivalent protections to be disclosed at all in 2022, and none of them really ever required to expire. The IPO's market version of the consensus fiction has a sunset clause and the art market does not. So who sets the price for art? The same kind of people who set the price for a share of SpaceX before the public ever got to see it. The people who already have the most money invested in the answer. The difference is that SpaceX's insiders eventually have to let go and find out if they were right, and the art market insiders, more often than not, never have to find out at all. So that was the episode. That was Gilt Index, the anchor, the lockup, the burn, the right of first refusal, one consensus fiction built twice, one with an expiration date and one without. I'm Gilt Index everywhere. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe. Also, I love when people comment, so please comment like any of your thoughts. I love to see other people's perspectives, so let me know. Thank ya. Bye.